Today, Wall Street is one of the most powerful financial corridors on Earth. Trillions of dollars move through its markets. Global economies rise and fall with its signals. Decisions made here ripple outward across continents. But beneath the glass towers, beneath the trading floors and digital screens, lies a far older story. A story that begins not with bankers, but with fear. Before Wall Street became the symbol of modern capitalism, it was something very different. It was a barrier. A wall built from timber, earth, and desperation. And its purpose was not wealth. It was survival. To understand how the financial heart of the modern world began, we must travel back nearly 4 centuries, as to a time when Manhattan was not a metropolis, but a fragile colonial outpost on the edge of an unknown continent. In the early 17th century, the island of Manhattan was still largely wilderness. Dense forests covered the landscape. Rivers and marshes carved through the terrain. Wild animals roamed where skyscrapers now stand. The land was home to the Lenape people, who had lived in the region for generations, navigating its waterways and forests long before European ships appeared on the horizon. But in the 1600s, a new force arrived in North America: European empires. Spain had already conquered vast territories to the south. France was exploring the northern rivers and fur trade routes. England was steadily expanding its colonies along the Atlantic coast. And the Dutch Republic, one of the most powerful trading nations of the era, had its own ambitions. Through the Dutch West India Company, the Netherlands sought to establish a commercial foothold in the New World. Their objective was not conquest, it was trade. Fur, timber, and maritime commerce promised enormous profits. And in 1624, the Dutch established a small settlement at the southern tip of Manhattan. They called it New Amsterdam. At first, the colony was modest, a cluster of wooden houses, warehouses along the harbor, a trading post connecting European merchants with indigenous trade networks. Ships arrived carrying goods from Europe. They departed loaded with valuable beaver pelts that would eventually become fashionable hats in the cities of Europe. But life on the frontier was uncertain. New Amsterdam sat at the crossroads of competing powers. To the north were French traders. To the east, English settlements were expanding rapidly. To the west stretched vast and largely unknown territories. The colony was small, vulnerable, and dangerously exposed. By the early 1650s, tensions in the Atlantic world were escalating. European empires were not merely competing in trade, they were competing for territory. Naval wars between England and the Dutch Republic had already erupted across the oceans. Colonial settlements became strategic outposts in a much larger geopolitical struggle. For the Dutch settlers of New Amsterdam, the threat was very real. English colonies in New England were growing quickly. Their populations were larger. Their militias were stronger. And if conflict reached Manhattan, the Dutch settlement could easily be overwhelmed. The geography of the colony made the situation even more dangerous. New Amsterdam occupied only the southern tip of the island. Beyond it lay wilderness, forests, unsettled land that could allow enemies to approach undetected. Governor Peter Stuyvesant, the Dutch colonial leader, understood the vulnerability of the settlement. If New Amsterdam was to survive, it needed protection. And in 1653, the Dutch made a decision that would change the future of Manhattan forever. They would build a wall. The wall was not meant to be a monumental stone fortress like those of Europe. New Amsterdam did not have the resources for such massive construction. Instead, the settlers turned to the materials they had in abundance: timber, earth, and labor. Dutch engineers designed a defensive barrier stretching across the northern edge of the settlement. It ran roughly along the line of what is today known as Wall Street. Construction began with a trench. Workers dug deep into the soil to create a foundation. Into this trench, they placed wooden, post-large timber beams cut from the forests of Manhattan. These posts were driven into the ground and reinforced with horizontal planks. Behind the timber barrier, earth was piled high to create a rampart. The result was a defensive wall approximately 12 feet high, not enormous, but strong enough to slow attackers. A wooden palisade ran along the top, forming a sharp barrier against intruders. Guard posts were established along the structure, and gates allowed controlled access between the settlement and the wilderness beyond. The wall stretched from river to river, from the Hudson in the west to the East River in the east. It sealed off the northern boundary of New Amsterdam. For the Dutch settlers, it was more than just a piece of engineering. It was a line between civilization and uncertainty. On one side stood the colony. On the other side, the unknown. Though simple in appearance, the wall represented a remarkable feat of colonial engineering. Dutch builders were already known in Europe for their expertise in managing difficult landscapes. The Netherlands itself had been shaped through centuries of engineering dikes, canals, and drainage systems that reclaimed land from the sea. That knowledge traveled with the settlers. In New Amsterdam, engineers adapted their techniques to frontier conditions. The wall had to be strong enough to resist attack, but flexible enough to be built quickly. Timber palisades were ideal. They required fewer specialized tools than stone fortifications. They could be constructed rapidly using local materials, and they could absorb impacts better than rigid stone walls. The earth rampart behind the timber added additional stability. If attackers fired muskets or cannon, the packed soil could absorb much of the force. In many ways, the Wall of New Amsterdam represented a hybrid, design blend of European military engineering and frontier improvisation. It was built not for grandeur, but for survival. For the settlers of New Amsterdam, the wall quickly became part of daily life. Soldiers patrolled its length. Merchants passed through its gates. Farmers from outside the settlement entered the city to sell goods. The wall marked the boundary between the structured world of the colony and the wilderness beyond. But it also shaped the geography of the settlement itself. Along its southern side, a road formed, a simple path running parallel to the defensive barrier. Over time, this road became an important meeting place. Merchants gathered there. Trade negotiations took place. Goods were exchanged between settlers and travelers entering the city. No one at the time could have imagined that this narrow colonial road would one day become the financial center of the world. But history often begins in the most unexpected places. For more than a decade, the wall stood guard over New Amsterdam. It was never the largest fortification in the colonial world, nor the most sophisticated, but it represented something important: security, a visible line that told settlers their fragile colony could survive on a dangerous frontier. Yet history rarely respects defensive lines. Across the Atlantic, the struggle for power between European empires continued to escalate. England and the Dutch Republic were not merely competing for trade routes, they were competing for dominance of the seas. Naval battles erupted across the Atlantic. Merchant ships became targets. Colonies became strategic prizes. And in the summer of 1664, that global rivalry arrived at the shores of Manhattan. One morning, Dutch settlers looked out across New York Harbor and saw something alarming. 4 English warships, their sails filled with wind, their cannons aimed toward the small colony at the southern tip of the island. The message from the English fleet was simple: surrender the colony or face destruction. Governor Peter Stuyvesant wanted to resist. The proud Dutch commander believed New Amsterdam should defend itself. But the reality was unavoidable. The settlement had few soldiers, its defenses were limited, and the wall, though useful against small attacks, was no match for the cannons of the British Navy. The colonists themselves refused to fight. Many feared that resistance would destroy the town they had worked so hard to build. And so, without a single shot fired, the Dutch colony surrendered. New Amsterdam became New York, named in honor of the Duke of York, brother of the English king. The wall remained, but its meaning had changed forever. Under English control, Manhattan began to evolve. The colony grew. Trade expanded. Ships arrived carrying goods from Europe, the Caribbean, and the American mainland. The defensive wall that once protected the settlement slowly became less important. The frontier moved farther north. New farms appeared beyond the old barrier. Villages developed across the island. The wall was no longer the edge of civilization. It had become something else, an obstacle. By the late 17th century, the structure that once represented survival began to look outdated. Maintaining the wooden palisade required constant repairs. Storms damaged sections of it. Rot weakened the timber. And as the city expanded northward, the wall simply stood in the way. In 1699, the decision was made. The wall would be dismantled. Workers removed the timber posts. The earthen ramparts were flattened. The gates were taken down. The defensive line that once defined the colony disappeared. But the name remained. The road that ran alongside it continued to be called Wall Street. And slowly, that street began to take on a new identity. In the early 1700s, Wall Street was no longer a military boundary. It had become a place of commerce. Merchants gathered along the street to buy and sell goods. Cargo from ships arriving in the harbor moved through nearby markets. Traders negotiated deals beneath the shade of trees. The street sat at a strategic location between the harbor and the expanding city. It naturally became a hub of economic activity. But the transformation of Wall Street from trading street to financial center did not happen overnight. It happened slowly, through countless small exchanges, through merchants bargaining over cargo shipments, through traders speculating on the value of goods arriving from distant ports. These early markets were informal. There were no stock exchanges, no digital trading systems, no towering financial institutions. Just people, standing in the street, making deals. By the late 18th century, the American colonies had undergone another dramatic transformation. The American Revolution had reshaped the political map of North America. New York was now part of a new nation, the United States. Commerce was expanding rapidly. Shipping routes connected American ports to Europe, the Caribbean, and Asia. And a new type of economic instrument was beginning to appear: stocks, government bonds, private investments. But there was a problem. The trading of these financial instruments was chaotic. Dealers often competed aggressively against one another. Prices fluctuated wildly. And without clear rules, the market lacked stability. In 1792, a group of 24 traders decided to change that. They gathered on Wall Street beneath a large buttonwood tree. There, they signed a simple document. It became known as the Buttonwood Agreement. The agreement established two basic principles. First, traders would conduct transactions only with one another. Second, they would charge a standardized commission. It was a small step, but it created something new: a structured financial marketplace. From that moment forward, the foundations of what would become the New York Stock Exchange had been laid. And it all happened on a street that once held a wooden wall. During the 19th century, Wall Street began to evolve rapidly. The United States was expanding westward. Railroads stretched across the continent. Factories multiplied. Industrialization transformed the American economy. And financing these massive projects required enormous capital. Banks, investors, railroad magnates, industrial tycoons. They all turned to Wall Street. Companies issued stocks to raise money. Investors speculated on the future of industries. The small street that once marked the boundary of a Dutch colony became the center of a financial ecosystem. By the late 1800s, Wall Street had already begun to influence markets far beyond New York. European investors watched American railroads closely. International capital flowed through the city, and towering office buildings began to appear near the historic street. Ironically, the same island that once needed a wooden wall for protection would soon become home to the first skyscrapers. The financial district began to grow upward, just as the rest of Manhattan would later do. Today, Wall Street is more than a physical location. It is a symbol, a shorthand for the global financial system. The street itself is relatively small, yet the influence of the institutions surrounding it is enormous. Investment banks, stock exchanges, financial firms managing trillions of dollars. But beneath that modern financial machine lies a strange historical irony. Wall Street began as a line of defense, a wooden barrier built by colonists who feared invasion. The people who built it were not imagining global markets. They were thinking about survival, protecting their homes, securing their settlement. And yet, over centuries, that defensive line evolved into something completely different. A place where wealth, risk, and ambition converge. Epilogue: From Wall to World. Today, almost nothing remains of the original wall. No timber posts, no earth ramparts, no guard towers. But the street that carries its name still exists. And beneath the foundations of modern skyscrapers, the memory of that defensive barrier remains buried in the soil of Manhattan. It reminds us that history rarely moves in straight lines. A wall meant to defend a fragile colony became the name of the most powerful financial street on Earth. And the story of Wall Street did not begin with bankers or traders. It began with engineers, settlers, and a desperate attempt to protect a tiny settlement on the edge of the wilderness. From timber barricade to financial empire. Few places on Earth illustrate the unpredictable path of history more clearly than Wall Street.